Hi everyone, this is Subeda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. Welcome back to our series on St. John of the Cross's Ascent of Mount Carmel. Today I'm going to be reviewing chapters 13 through 16 from book 2. And in our last video, we spoke of the necessity of abandoning discursive meditation and to pursue the prayer of quiet, the prayer of contemplation that leads to contemplation. And in this chapter, St. John of the Cross talks about what's the right time, when should we abandon discursive meditation, and what are the signs that we would observe so it is safe to pursue just the prayer of the quiet. So it is important to not abandon discursive meditation sooner or later. Proper time is important so the soul doesn't experience regression in its spiritual life. So discursive meditation is the essential path for beginners to dispose their spirit and habituate it to spiritual things. So then he speaks of 3 signs that we will observe within ourselves in order for us to determine at that point, with the help of a spiritual director, if we should only pursue the prayer of quiet and not force ourselves to discursive meditation. So the first sign, he says, is the realization that we cannot make discursive meditation, or it will feel forced and we don't derive any satisfaction from it, spiritual satisfaction. The second basically is an awareness of disinclination to fix the mind or senses and faculties on any other particular objects, exterior and interior. And the soul is purely focused on things of God alone. And the third sign, the person likes to remain alone, in solitude, in loving awareness of God, in interior peace, quiet and repose, without the acts and the exercises of the intellect, memory and will, even in prayer. So to safely leave the state of meditation and sense and enter that of contemplation and spirit, spiritual persons must observe within themselves at least these 3 signs, and not just 1 or 2, but all these 3 signs together. So first, incapable of making a discursive meditation. Second, a disinclination to consider subjects extraneous to God. And third, the loving knowledge and awareness of peace in God, and an absence of melancholy. And in the beginning of this state, the loving knowledge is almost unnoticeable, and St. John of the Cross gives 2 reasons for that. The loving knowledge is extremely subtle and delicate, and it is almost imperceptible. Second, unlike with meditation, which is wholly sensible, this loving knowledge is hardly perceivable and can feel like this new, insensible, purely spiritual experience, and care must be taken to not fail to understand this. And not allowing oneself to rest in it would be a mistake. And trying to seek more sensory experience through discursive meditation, that would also be a mistake. So that's the right time to give up the discursive meditation, and care must be taken to allow room for rest and quiet to enjoy this interior peace. The more a person becomes habituated to this calm, the more their experience of this general loving knowledge of God will increase. This is more enjoyable than all other things, because without the soul's labor, it affords peace, rest, savor and delight. And in chapter 14, St. John of the Cross will expound the necessity of these 3 signs in order to journey on the road of the Spirit. So chapter 14, 2 reasons why we must enter the way of the Spirit and the contemplative way, and give up the imaginative way and sensory meditation, when they don't derive satisfaction in it, first he says, all the spiritual good obtainable through discursive meditation on the things of God have already been granted to these persons. And that is why God himself is allowing them to experience this distaste for discursive meditation, at the same time a desire for God and a desire for solitary prayer of the quiet. And the second, these persons have substantially and habitually acquired the spirit of meditation, as the knowledge and love of the act of meditation has become a habit without effort. The soul without labor, from the moment it begins to pray, it attains peace and enters into an act of general loving, peaceful and tranquil knowledge, wisdom, love and delight of God. And these persons experience difficulty and displeasure when they are asked to meditate or work with particular concepts. Because as soon as they sit down to pray, they enter into the prayer of the quiet. They enter the top of the room on top of the stair where there is peace and we repose in the Lord. And then, they do not want to go back to climb the stairs again. At the beginning of this state, where one encounters loving, substantial quietude, where nothing particular is understood, it appears like wasting time, straying from the right path, like backsliding or going astray. People can become disturbed with these thoughts, but it is not so. For they are losing the exercise of their own senses and first mode of experience. They are approaching the spirit being imparted to them, where the less they understand, the further they penetrate into the night of the spirit. One must pass through this night to a union with God beyond all knowing. Worldly images, even those that concern God, are dissatisfying to them. Imagination wanders back and forth during recollection. These individuals do not desire or find delight in this, but they are troubled because it disturbs the gratifying peace they enjoyed during the prayer of recollection. And the third sign, the loving general knowledge or the awareness of God, it is a requirement in order for the person to discontinue discursive meditation. They must be able to first be able to have this general awareness and the knowledge of God. So the spiritual faculties, that is memory, intellect, will remain passively united to God with an attentiveness, and it's prepared to receive knowledge that God wants to impart to that soul during this time of quiet prayer. The faculties will have no activity but remain passively receptive to God. The prepared knowledge is received through the spiritual faculties, and it is not conceived or received through the sensory faculties of the person. And then he gives a comparison between discursive meditation and contemplation. That is, in this particular case, it's the loving knowledge and the loving awareness of God. The discursive meditation is of sensory in nature, and it is sensitive faculties. No, we use the faculty of the senses. Whereas contemplation or the loving knowledge and the awareness of God, the person is only exercising their spiritual faculties. Whereas discursive meditation requires human effort and toil, with the contemplation, it is an enjoyment of the fruits of the toil. So the human effort is none. It is only a fruit of our previous toils. And discursive meditation, you can say, is the drudgery of the journey, and contemplation is rest and quiet, gladdening at its end, so the end of the journey. And then he gives this metaphor of cooking a meal. Discursive meditation is like cooking a meal, and contemplation is basically eating without effort what has already been cooked and prepared. So receiving a gift and profiting by it, that's what the contemplation is. So this general knowledge imparted by God during contemplation, because it is not originating from the human faculties or the human senses, it is purer, it is simpler, it's more perfect, it is spiritual, and it is interior. We say more perfect and not perfect because that perfection only comes in the end, after our earthly life. So it is more perfect, but it still has the human element in some veiled fashion. It's there. For this reason, the soul barely perceives or is aware of this, because the knowledge is imparted by God supernaturally. It is very subtle, and the soul can barely perceive that it is even happening. On the other hand, the less pure and the less simple knowledge appears more clear and important to the individual because it is mingled with some intelligible forms. For example, he uses again the metaphor of a ray of sunlight. A ray of sunlight that is streaming through the window appears clearer and palpable when it is pervaded by dust particles. However, when it is purer and cleaner without any dust particles, the ray of sunlight would be invisible. Because without striking any object, the ray of light would be invisible to the naked eye. Similarly, the spiritual light that is purer and clearer would be incomprehensible, obscure, inapprehensible, impalpable to the intellect, which is the eye of the soul. This supernatural general knowledge and light is so pure, so simple, and shines in the intellect free from all intelligible forms or objects that it is imperceptible to the soul. That even at times it causes darkness, since it's devoid of the customary lights, forms, and fantasies. It appears almost like dark, like so bright that it blinds us. When individuals experience this, they remain in deep oblivion and do not realize where they were, what occurred, how time passed. The person could have spent many hours in this state of oblivion, but upon returning, they feel that they only spent a moment or no time had passed. And the knowledge imparted during contemplation on the soul is pure, it's simple, it's clear. The soul itself is rendered simple, pure, and without any apprehensions and forms through which the senses and memory were acting when it was conscious of time. Since the soul is united with pure knowledge, which is independent of time, this prayer is short or feels short because it is not in time, it is in eternity, So in a way we are in this, even in this life we can be united in eternity during contemplation. The effects of this prayer are an elevation of the mind to heavenly knowledge, withdrawal and abstraction from all objects, forms, figures, and any remembrance of them. And then again, St. John of the Cross goes to the scripture. He speaks of David in Psalm 102. David describes this experience was like a solitary sparrow on the rooftop or on the housetop. So withdrawal and abstraction from all things, that is solitary. Mind elevated on high, the housetop. So the individual is idle. They are not working with their senses or faculties. They must believe that they are not wasting time. The harmonious interaction of their sensory and spiritual faculties ceases. The intellect is occupied with knowledge, simple and pure awareness of God. And again, in Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 2, my heart watches supernaturally though I sleep, my heart watches, supernaturally elevated to supernatural knowledge. And again, Song of Songs, chapter 6, verse 12, I knew not, which is oblivion. So these are all references that you can read and meditate on. So Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 2, and chapter 6, verse 12. So we are in oblivion, so I knew not. And then, though I sleep, my heart watches, supernaturally elevated to supernatural knowledge. Oh, these are all, references to contemplation. The simple and pure awareness of God is a knowledge that abstracts the soul from the exercise of all the natural and spiritual, example, meditation, faculties. Because this knowledge does not take up the entire soul, this forgetfulness is less frequent. So contemplation doesn't occur as frequently, and it doesn't take up the entire soul. So abstraction of intellect from natural and spiritual things. When only this occurs, it's perceptible to the soul, and the soul wonders why it's unable to or unwilling to think on these things. Abstraction of the intellect and will. When this occurs, the soul is unable to discern their state and experiences delight of love or general loving knowledge or vague delight and love are given to the will. So you hear he speaks of the impact that it has on the will, the intellect, and how they are all impacted, and how meditation compares with contemplation. So one must understand the need for the general knowledge and awareness of God's presence before leaving discursive meditative way. Despite it appearing to be apparent idleness, the soul is well employed if these three signs are noticeable. It is all the spiritual good obtained through discursive meditation have already been granted to the soul. These persons have substantially and habitually acquired the spirit of meditation and the loving general awareness of God, along with the abstraction of the intellect, and most often abstraction of the intellect and will. So these are the things that then the soul that enjoys the light in a more comprehensible and palpable way may not actually be a sign of its greater purity or holiness or its sublimity, but it is rather a gift from God. And he talks about Aristotle and other theologians who assert the higher and more sublime the divine light, the darker it is to our intellect. So, and because it is not of the person's holiness, but it is a gift from God, we have to not feel proud in any way if we do experience contemplation. The nature and the effects produced by this divine knowledge will be discussed in later chapters. And this knowledge or divine light is extraordinary, supernatural, it's obscure. The duration of the knowledge also will be discussed in the next chapter. So in chapter 15, those who experience this general knowledge of the presence of God in contemplation must not completely discontinue discursive meditation. So at the beginning, this state of contemplation, it is not perfect. That is, one will not be able to enter into contemplation at will, nor will they completely be incapable of discursive meditation. So it is good for the individual to continue the practice of meditation until they acquire the habit of contemplation to a perfect degree, to a certain perfect degree. The sign, again, he says of this. So, again, it's all happening. It's not going to happen like instantly. So it's a gradual process. So there will be a time or a phase when you will be going through. It won't be a habitual contemplation, but it will be, sometimes you'll be able to meditate and sometimes you are more inclined to contemplation. But it'll take much time and practice and commitment to prayer in order to acquire the or to be gifted by God with the habitual contemplation. So it is good for the individual to continue the practice of meditation until we acquire the habit of contemplation to a perfect degree. So the sign of this is that when they intend to meditate, they immediately enter into the knowledge and peace of the presence of God in contemplation and lack the desire to meditate. So it's not unwilling, but it's more like they're unable to meditate. These souls will find themselves in the loving or peaceful awareness of God without having to do any meditation with their faculties. Frequently, they will find it necessary to gently and moderately aid themselves by meditation in order to enter this state. God does the work in the soul, and God produces the knowledge and delight, but the soul itself does nothing but remains attentively loving to God. The soul passively receives God's self-communication just as we receive light passively without doing anything except by keeping our eyes open. Similarly, God infuses light into the soul supernaturally. The soul knows passively. God illumines and bestows inspiration while the soul receives passively. In order to receive the greater divine light in simplicity and abundance, none of the other palpable lights from discursive meditation must be commingled with the simple and pure light. Otherwise, these things, however spiritual, will become a hindrance and will interfere with their cloudy thoughts and will be obstacles in front of the eye and impede the soul from seeing the pure and simple light. Then souls have purified themselves of all forms of apprehensions and images. Then they will abide in the pure and simple light and be perfectly transformed in it. If the soul eliminates all impediments and has a poverty of spirit, the light is always present for it, for all the veils that cover it are no longer present. The soul must live in pure nakedness and poverty of spirit. Then the pure and simple light will transform the soul perfectly to make it pure and simple into the Son of God, who is pure wisdom. As soon as natural things are driven out of the enamored soul, the divine are naturally and supernaturally infused, since there can be no void in nature. So that's the first thing, is to be able to detach ourselves from the desire for natural things. That is essential in order for us to enter into this state. When spiritual persons cannot meditate, they should learn to remain in God's presence with a loving attention and tranquil intellect, even though they seem to appear to be idle. Eventually, gradually, the divine calm, peace with knowledge of God and divine love will envelop the soul and infuse them. They should not force themselves to discursive meditations and imaginings. If they do that, it will interfere with their soul and cause a disquiet and bring it out of peaceful contentment to disdain and repugnance. I've actually observed this with some people who I've prayed with, and I even have seen some people who just leave because they're unable to pray or meditate like many others would do by reading the scripture and following a particular method, because the moment they sit down to pray, they are immediately enveloped by this loving awareness of God's presence, and they will soar into contemplation just at the thought of God, and they can no longer be present to what is going on around them. And that is a beautiful problem to have, actually. And moving on to the final chapter for today's video, chapter 16 in book 2. So we just discussed the uselessness of discursive meditation if you're being called, or if God is leading you into the path of contemplation, and also that a natural apprehension to active contemplation or the union of the soul with God. Um, when the soul has reached that point, we should be aware not to struggle against that, but rather to allow the soul to benefit from that active contemplation. But in this chapter 16, the discussion is about the supernatural apprehensions or imaginative visions. Just like natural apprehensions, which like visions and dreams and things like that, the supernatural visions and dreams, they are also bound by image, form, and figure. And so even the natural, which is seen visibly, and the supernatural, they're all, they're all impediment, you can say, because not even the supernatural visions that use image, form, and figure cannot resemble the pure, simple knowledge of God. The pure, simple knowledge of God that we receive directly into our spirit and in our soul during contemplation is of the most highest degree and is of the most perfect kind. So here he talks of the imaginative visions, that is, image, forms, figures, and species that are impressed upon supernaturally. So not naturally, like naturally would be through our own imagination and through our reading and all that, but this is even supernaturally, that is received without going through the five bodily senses. Internally, the vision is received in the intellect and memory, whether naturally through the five senses or supernaturally. The intellect considers and makes judgment about them. And the fantasy can even impose and imagine other objects resembling those known to it. So there's real things that we have actually seen that we can imagine, that we can have visions about, dream about, but we can also use our imagination to build on that. But still, the five exterior senses are the ones that are initiating those, the other ones sending the images, the species, the objects to the interior senses. And similar to God, even the devil can supernaturally send images, species of objects to our interior faculties without going through our exterior senses. While God uses these often, they are more beautiful, they are perfect images and forms, and they are to teach the soul that's receiving them some wisdom, some lesson. Like we read in the scriptures, the visions of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and so many, and even in the New Testament we have Joseph and so many others having visions, John and St. Paul. Similarly, we know that the devil can also do that. Examples of devil communicating are also in the Bible, and St. John of the Cross gives examples from 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 11 through 12 and 21 to 22, that the prophets of Ahab, they also saw false visions. And then we see Pilate's wife, who is not of a Jewish origin. She has a vision, and that it doesn't conform to the will of God. That is, she's telling Pilate not to condemn Jesus. But in that particular case, St. John of the Cross says that was not God's will, because Jesus himself said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," when Peter says he is not to suffer the passion. So that's what St. John of the Cross says, that sometimes even the devil can communicate supernaturally some visions into our interior faculty. And God does that for good reasons, and obviously the devil does that for the wrong reasons. So these are interior imaginative visions received more frequently than the exterior corporeal visions. The effect of the imaginative visions are subtle and can be sometimes even more effective than the corporeal visions. In both cases, it is God who produces the desired effects in the soul. So now we are talking about the good visions. And The imagination and fantasy are gateway to the soul. Now, if the devil comes with his wiles, he could also influence both our natural and our supernatural, both natural and supernatural ways. He can try to influence our interior senses. And he compares the intellect to a market. Both God and devil come to the intellect with jewels of images and supernatural forms. God does not depend on this alone to impart knowledge to the soul. So, in essence, like in previous chapters, he is saying to be cautious about these interior visions as well, dreams, and as well as corporeal visions and dreams, because God will produce its effect right away, and then if we don't ponder on it and if we don't desire it, it's going to be, if it is from the devil, it will not have any effect on us. The signs for discernment of good visions from bad visions. So there are various kinds of visions, and here St. John of the Cross wishes to instruct the intellect so it will not be hindered or impeded from union with God and the divine wisdom, and to not be deceived by the false vision. So he's giving some signs of discernment. These visions may be based on a particular theme, but the individual must not feed upon it or be encumbered by it. And these persons must neither accept nor reject, but be detached, pure and simple. In order for the intellect to unite with God's wisdom, it must in certain extent resemble God's likeness. God's wisdom has neither mode nor manner, has no limits, does not pertain to particular knowledges. It's pure and simple. The soul and divine wisdom are two extremes. The soul, in order to be united to God's wisdom, must become pure, must become simple, must become unlimited and unattached to any particular knowledge, unmodified by the boundaries of form, species, and image. For God cannot be encompassed by any image, form, or particular knowledge. I know there's a lot of repetition here, but he's basically saying the soul is so far away in resemblance from God that we have a long way to go in prayer in order to become united with God, who is divine wisdom, who is all-knowing, and who is all-powerful. And so we have to become pure and simple ourselves. God has no form or likeness. God is present in cloud, obscurity, vague, darkness, fire, as we see in Mount Horeb. And the soul cannot ascend to God in this life by means of any forms or figures. God communicated to Moses, but not through images, visions, and figures alone, but God communicated to Moses in a high state of union. And God is love, and his essence is love, and the soul that is pure and naked will only be the one that will be able to be in union with God. The effects and the supernatural infusion of knowledge occurs immediately without the effort of the soul as soon as the vision occurs. So a person must not look or desire for these visions in order to attain the union of love with God. They are not a means for the union. So as long as we keep the goal in mind, that's what we are desiring, to be united with God, these visions will not be things that we'll be desiring for, but rather we'll be desiring for God. O soul that seeks after these spiritual apprehensions will be so preoccupied with these that it becomes a hindrance and lacks the freedom of spirit and simplicity needed to be well disposed for the essential union of the soul with God. The intellect will be tied up and not free to receive the spiritual communications that God wants to give that. And St. John of the Cross uses this metaphor of the kiss of God and the soul, and that is how he compares the higher state of the union of the soul with God. He describes that as the kiss between God and the soul, a soul that is pure and God who is love. So the form, image, and particular knowledge are the least important. The more important is the spirituality infused in the soul passively, imperceptibly. Those are the most powerful transformation that the soul experiences. The eyes of the soul should be always withdrawn from visible and intelligible apprehensions and must be totally focused on the invisible. The eyes of the soul should be focused on the spirit and blind to the exterior senses and the faculties as well, interior faculties. The soul comes in union with God only through the means of faith, and so the soul should reject the sensible and intelligible aspect and be free to receive the supernatural infusion that one is given in contemplation. If God gives supernatural visions, shouldn't we pay attention to it? Why does God bestow them upon a soul if it could lead them into errors and dangers? Well, St. John of the Cross wants to keep us in suspense. He says he will answer these questions in a later chapter. And then he says these visions can become an attachment and cause possessiveness even if they are true and from God. God does not impose the soul to analyze and reject or accept these visions. And he says in order to advance in faith, one must close the eyes of the soul to the senses and to clear and particular knowledge. And faith should be the candle shining in a dark place. That light of the candle, faith, also is dark. Dark light of faith. And he says the intellect is a candle holder on which the candle of faith is placed. And that's what will light the way for us to God. The darkness remains until in the next life. Because when we enter next life, we no longer need faith, for we will see God. When we see the clear vision of God that dawns upon the soul, there will be no need for having faith. So then the darkness will be gone. The darkness remains in this life until the daybreak of transformation in and union with God, the goal of a person's journey. So at the end of this life's journey, we want to be able to reach God individually and as a community and as a whole human race. We all want to be saved and we want to be in God's presence for all eternity. That is the goal of every person's life, the purpose and meaning of life. So with that, we conclude today's series episode on St. John of the Cross's Ascent of Mount Carmel. Thank you for watching. I hope you're having a blessed Lent. Pray for me and I will be praying for you to also have a good Lent